Hi, welcome everyone. Excited that you could join us again on Below the Radar. Have Michael Roberson here with us, activist, educator, public health practitioner, and many, many other things. Welcome, Michael. Wondering if you can just start by introducing yourself a little bit.
So my name is Michael. Well, first of all, welcome, and I'm very not only excited to be in dialogue with you, but very happy that you invited me to be in dialogue with you. My name is Michael Roberson. I am originally from Camden, New Jersey. Camden is a small inner city across the bridge from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My trajectory about Camden is that it's hood. I can say that because I'm from there. I'm going to create a word that you can't get any hooder than Camden. Camden, Detroit, Baltimore, all of these sort of northeastern, midwestern urban cities have very similar infrastructure, very similar problems. So yeah, I was born there, reared there, went to school there, graduated from Rutgers University, applied to law school twice, got accepted, and put on a waiting list and got tired of waiting and began working for the Kansas City Board of Education as a crisis counselor. Then I moved to New York City in 1999 with $177 worth of change to do public health, much more concentrated with Black LGBT folk, Black Latino LGBT folk, and more specifically the houseball ballroom community. I was blessed enough to create some things, and then in 2008, I got fired in a very public and very painful way. One of the great Greek philosophers, Montaigne, says that philosophy is about learning how to die. And for me, there was a death in me, and if philosophy was learning how to die, then theology is about rebirth. And so I went to seminary and got 2 master's degrees in theology, but not to be a minister at all. But I wanted to place public health in conversation with theology because it was my assertion that the theological abomination narrative had direct impact on health disparities impacting Black gay men. And so since then, because I've been doing public health for 27 years, since then I've started doing public health as a consultant, and I've also been doing race and sexuality and theological work through the Center for Race and Religion and Economic Democracy for the last 9 years, along with the public health. I am a member of the international sound art collective called UltraRED. UltraRED emerges out of the ACT UP movement in 1994 with artists like Dr. Ryan, who thought that sound could be an apparatus or an investigative tool, particularly as you engage in oppressive structures. More specifically at the time, looking at the AIDS crisis and IV drug users and gay men. And so it's been around for 26 years, and UltraRED has 6 projects around the world, 1 in Berlin, 2 in London, 2 in Los Angeles, 1 in New York City. The 1 in New York City, my colleague Robert and I oftentimes organize, which is a collective called Vogology around the houseball ballroom community. So for the last 8 years, I've been doing international art and politics through UltraRED. I am an adjunct professor, a teacher, a 2-day course at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and 2 courses with Robert Simber at the New School University in New York City. And the last thing I'll say about me is that 2 things. I am blessed enough to be a cultural consultant for the new FX show Pose about the ballroom community. And I was just hired 4 weeks ago as a public health advisor and a community engagement specialist for the New York City COVID-19 contact tracing initiative. So, yeah.
Wow. I wanted to speak with you a little bit about, if you could talk a little bit more about UltraRED, like coming out of the ACT UP movement in the US, particularly for audiences here in Vancouver and Canada who may not be aware of it. It'd be great to get a little bit of background in terms of how long you've been working in public health, particularly around HIV/AIDS and also other health impacts.
So I come to UltraRED through Robert Simber. I met Dr. Ryan through Robert. Oh my God, this has for about I think 11 years. 2009, Robert was he had a residency at the New School just prior to him becoming a assistant professor there, and UltraRED was looking at doing some work around the houseball ballroom community. And I had introduced Robert more broadly to a colleague of mine, both of ours, who we call the mother of HIV prevention and community organizing in the ballroom community in Arbor, Santana. And Robert and Arbor and Dant created the Arbor Santana, no, at the time it was called the Ballroom Oral History Project, looking at sort of the oral history of the house ball community and the ability, again, to use this archival history as a way to organize. This was, so for Robert and Dant, this was very dialogical to UltraRed's work, because UltraRed was becoming less artists, but more organizers who use art, right? Robert is absolutely, but he's organizing. The same thing with Don. But we begin to attract not only people in UltraRed who they were doing work with, maybe not be official members, but also the communities that UltraRed began doing work through. So UltraRed, for instance, do a lot of work in the West Coast in Los Angeles, work around pedagogy, the School of Echoes, but also work around migration issues, particularly with migrant workers in East LA. In London, they do a lot of work around gentrification and sort of political movements that way. And then again, in New York City, we do a lot of work around household ballroom community. One of the things for me, I became familiar with UltraRed through Robert in 2009, and around 2012 they asked me, because UltraRed was hired by colleagues of ours now, an art collector called Arica, which is in Glasgow, Scotland, who was the first non-US artist to be commissioned to do the Whitney Biennial, and they hired UltraRed to organize their week full of events. And so UltraRed created a week full of events and called it the Sounds of Freedom, looking at historical art movements, because UltraRed's an art movement in many ways, who used art to investigate systems of oppression. And so they got a guy named George Lewis, who was at Columbia University. He did a lot of work around jazz, and he did he did a protocol around jazz and electric guitar and just some performances. Fred Moten, one of the premier scholars around the Black radical aesthetic tradition. They also got him to do some work around that same thing. He did a protocol around that and did some performances. And then it got to people, can't think of their names at the moment, who are pivotal in sort of the organizing, the creation of the New Yorker poet movement in New York City. And they did some work around that, and they asked me to do the work around ballrooms, to do a protocol around ballroom. And so the first protocol for me was that the house ballroom community, being a community that's predominantly Black, Latino, and LGBT, was not going to perform at the Whitney. Partly was because, one, the expectation for us is to always just perform, not only because we're ballroom, but also because we're Black and Latino, as well as LGBT. The other thing for me was that, particularly in a space like the Whitney, who in its everyday operation doesn't offer opportunity or space for marginalized, particularly class marginalized communities to be involved at ballroom. But I was always a fan of Cornel West. And I remember listening to one of his lectures in 2006 on YouTube. I forgot who was honoring, and he talked about this notion of philosophy and freedom. And so I said, for me, instead of performing, ballroom has something to say. So I constructed a concentric circle format. Got 9 ballroom leaders to sit in a circle, and then we created concentric circles surrounding them, and about 100 plus people came to listen to the conversation. Because one of the protocols of UltraRed is that we do listening sessions, right? We either use audio or video. The video stuff really came from me, but to engage in dialogue for other folks to be able to listen to. And so had these folks sit around, these 9 ballroom folks, and I facilitated a conversation called what did I call them? The labors of oppression, and intersected labors of oppression, right? So I asked the non-ballroom people, for instance, the trans folk in the circle, in the ballroom community, I said to them, what does it mean to be a femme queen? A femme queen is a term we use for trans women in the house ball community. And so, they would respond to it. I asked the gay men the same thing. What does it mean to be a butch queen in a house ball community? And butch queen is just a term we use for gay men in the house ball community. So they responded. Then I took it a layer up. They had no idea that's what I was doing. And I asked them, what does it mean to be part of the house ball community within the larger Black LGBT community? So without them knowing where I wanted them to go, they began to talk about systemic classism, because historically there has been classism over and against the house ball community stemming from the larger Black LGBT community. So they began talking about that. So then I asked the next layered up question. What does it mean to be part of the Black LGBT community within a larger Black community? So they began to talk about systemic homophobia. So then I asked the question, what does it mean Black in America? They began to talk about systemic racism. So the fundamental question for me was then, through all of these intersected labors of oppression, because oppressions are laborious, right? They're not static. They're working with one another systemically and intentionally. I said, so through all of these labors of oppression, what does it really mean to be human and free? So they took a pause, and then this outpouring of dialogue that was emotive and everything began to happen. So after that happened, we took a break, took everyone, including those who was listening, so 100 plus people, to the back of the room, had big poster boards up, and I asked those who came to listen, not the ballroom folks, just 3 propositions. What did you hear? What did you see? What did you feel? And the kind of generative sort of formations that came out of those 3 propositions were amazing. This then opened up space for both Don, through Robert, UltraRED, but also Erica to say to me, oh, Michael, we think we want to do more work with you. So that began my relationship with UltraRED.
Now, when you are engaging in these art practices and community organizing, and then all of a sudden you kind of pry a door open into, say, public health agencies, clumsy, bureaucratic structures that are looking to get into communities to share information, get information back. How do you deal with moving across and being inside of that system all of a sudden, like that? When you pry open that space, all of a sudden you're in this whole zone of a bureaucracy and a world that speaks in different languages, that has different tones in terms of its bureaucratic inertias, these types of things. How did you navigate that context?
But to me, that's the beauty. This is an interesting conversation. That's the beauty of being both gay, so it's gay men, right? But also doing HIV prevention, because it oftentimes in the early days of AIDS movement, most of the people who were doing the work were artists, right? When I think about, let me talk about specifically Black gay men. When I think about, let me back into that. When I went to Union to get my first master's and my MDiv, I got a lot of pushback from professors that said that I was not lifting up enough theologians. And I said, well, you name some theologians who theologized around the intersection of my Blackness and the gayness, I'll lift them up. They thought I was lifting up too many artists, too many poets. But it was the poets, it was the artists who were also organizing. So there was the Essex Tinfield and the Joseph Bean and the Santos Saints who were talking about being Black and gay in a relationship to God, but also in relationship to the AIDS epidemic. So for me, for being part of the LGBT community, both being Black and being and the large LGBT community, it's just an easy. What's the word I want to use? The tension that you are sort of talking about or describing, it just felt that it was just it was a very easy sort of unfolding, right, if you will, right? And so if you think about, let me back into that, it's so interesting to have Tony Fauci to be in this moment around COVID, because Tony Fauci was also pivotal during AIDS, right? Absolutely. And so he became an ally of the community because ACT UP beat him, if you will, into submission, right? Taught him how to do what he does now. And so I'm describing sort of the same thing.
Yeah.
So for me, I didn't find it difficult. That's number one. But number two, I also think that being part of the houseball ballroom community and having to do work around the community that I belong to, it was also a very easy thing to say that if we are going to, let me say it differently, it was also an easier thing to say that if we are going to create interventions to address the HIV concerns of this community, that it's art practices, right? It's theological, or his art practices are both theological, political formulations around freedom and joy and all these other things that have everything to do with the way we deal with public health. Now, that doesn't mean there was not a public health in relation to HIV. It does not mean that we didn't get a lot of pushback. Absolutely, I got a lot of pushback.
When I first met you back in January, you also talked about this phenomenon, particularly in New York, of Black men being shunned from the church, and ballroom providing a kind of family, a support system around which wasn't really being identified by public health agencies either.
Yeah. And so some of that is a historical conversation. I think that is beginning to shift now. But part of the reason I went to Union Theological Seminary was for that very thing, that the theology of abomination has such a direct impact on health disparities impacting Black gay men, but that public health, its limitation around crisis management was not saving communities. And so that in which I desired to talk about, that in which I heard community members talk about public health in many ways, said that's religious, right? And there's very little space for that. So that's part of the reason why I went to seminary. But ballroom in and of itself, to your point, ballroom in and of itself, I think not only provided what I call a space for a political literacy, right? Even though we didn't think that's what it was doing, but it also created a space of a theological mattering. You know, when you've been told that the very essence of who you are is the antithesis to God, and God for Black folk have been the center of our freedom movement. It then says that you are not part of the lexicon of the Black struggle for freedom, but it also says that that in which you are desiring to have this relationship with God, you have no access to. And so ballroom, for me, created that space. And I think it creates that space for a lot of both Black, Latino, LGBT folk. Even though um, that there's not a lot of attention paid to that, there's not a lot of folk who are sort of articulating that. I'm a believer that that's exactly what it's doing. I give you a good example. You know, I am a consultant with the HEAT program, which is in Brooklyn, New York. And one of the things that we do is an intervention called Many Men, Many Voices, which in its original format, it is an HIV prevention behavioral change intervention that I helped to nationally diffuse for the Center for Disease Control from 2000 through 2007. So almost every community-based organization in New York, in the United States, that does work around Black gay men has to do that intervention. And so I facilitate that for the HEAT program, but I do it mostly, a lot of the times, I use Union Theological Seminary to do the intervention around young black gay men at the seminary. The very space that created pain is providing the space to reconcile that pain. So.
Now, I know that you collaborate a bunch with our mutual friend, Alessandra Pomarico, and Free Home University, and with the Musagetes Foundation. So you've been coming up to Toronto quite a bit, and in Guelph and other places. But I think given your background and story, it would be great to get some of your reflections in terms of how we can read the present political moment. There's so much going on with a pandemic, with Black Lives Matter, with Trump being president, and all of these things. I think that there's a lot of a sense of people being overwhelmed by the present political moment and how to orient oneself with all of these multiple crises on top of crises that already existed before. And I know that's a big question, but I wanted to throw that out to you to help us maybe think through that.
You know, I remember having initially a conversation with one of my great colleagues whose shoulder I stand on, named Kwame Banks. Kwame comes out of Philadelphia as well, and he is the very first person I saw do sort of ballroom and also community organizers, and intersecting of both. And we were talking about this moment, and I said that I'm a believer that the universe is asking us to take a cosmological pause. This is what the pandemic has done. So this part of the reason why we're paying so much attention to this moment, because we all are asked to take a pause, right? And so in this pause, I am a believer that there are three propositions that the universe is putting forth for us to sort of to contemplate on. One is a philosophical one. The philosophical question is, who do we desire to be? So when we move out of this moment, as we're moving out of this moment, who do we desire to be now? Right? It's not just who we're going to be, but who is it that we desire to be? The second one is a theological proposition, which is, how do we desire to love more expansively? If this moment, to me, has not taught us one thing, is that the notion of communities coming together and invoicing the ethic of love, if that's not the most important thing, then I think we've missed the moment. And the third one is a political proposition, which is, how do we begin to politically organize differently, moving away from our right not to die and moving towards the right to live. Those are two separate things. I think oftentimes marginalized communities are engaged in the political trajectory around, we deserve not to die. That's a different sentiment than saying, I claim my right to live. And so for me, that to me, those three things I think this moment is asking us to think about. It's very interesting that here we are in a pandemic that is illuminating, right, all of sort of the brokenness of our systems. And that, I will speak from a particular house ball lens, and that next year is the 40th anniversary of CRRED. So between two pandemics are we situated in? Now think about the 1980, Ronald Reagan becomes president, and he ushers in this move away from Barry Goldwater's ultra-conservative Republican, right, connected to less government, right, and more towards this new neoliberal project of the Republican Party, right, connected to global capitalism, the deregulation of banks. Reagan was very vociferous around the war on drugs, the disposable bodies, so disposing Black and brown bodies who were implied in this war on drugs into mass incarceration, but he was very silent around the AIDS epidemic. Again, disposable bodies, most of those who were being infected were gay men. And so here we are 40 years later, Trump being president, and there's a move towards away from the neoliberal Republican, connected to big bank, big monies, more towards a Trumpism that's really around fascism. And another pandemic emerges. And so in between those things, I think the illumination of, particularly in the US context, white supremacy, this moment of George Floyd, is something I think we have to sit back and reflect on. What are we being called to do? Right? What are we being called to ask? I think I was listening to a woman, my wife, on MSNBC today, and she talked about Black Lives Matter as a movement may have been contextualized or concretized in 2012 in relationship to Trayvon Martin. But the movement around mattering of Black lives has always been. It's just at this moment right now It's asking us to think differently. And part of what has happened is that it's allowed not only this sort of global kind of protest, but it's intersectional in its reach, where you're having particularly white folk in relationship with Black folk, in relationship with indigenous folk, in relationship with Latinos around the border wall, having this sort of kind of conversation. So I think that this is one of those moments. It could be one of those, it's a moment of watershed. This could be a watershed moment. How we then again address it, how we then again approach it, I think there's a difference. But I have said for a long time that Trump is an absolute blessing. And I know that sounds antithetical to progressive talk, but he's a blessing. And why he's a blessing? Because if Hillary had became president, though I voted for Hillary Clinton, if she became president, we would have still lived in the false pretense that we lived in a post-racial society. Obama became president, and so we don't need to have a conversation around race. We would have thought we would still lived in this notion that the next hurrah around civil rights was marriage equality. But then Trump becomes president, and his sort of his attack, particularly on trans lives and the military, particularly in the military and health and engaging in sort of these things of blocking health wellness for trans folk, have illuminating that that's not the case. And so, because of Trump, and this is not a supporter of Trump, because of Trump, that you're seeing folk who oftentimes have never been engaged in a dialogue of support. So I've seen Black men, Black cisgender men talk about Black trans women's lives in a certain kind of way. I'm seeing Black folk talk about and support of the immigration issues that a lot of Latinos are forced to confront in the U.S., which has never really occurred in such a kind of way. You're seeing this relationship between white folk, in particular in relation to health disparities and access to health, that is in conversation with poor Black folk that you've never really seen before. And I think this moment of Trump being president sort of caught that all together. Had there been Hillary, we would still live in the pretense that nothing was wrong or broken. And the last thing I'll say about that, and this COVID moment has illuminated all of the cracks that has been part of sort of our capitalist system.
So as we're speaking right now, we're a few days before July the 4th. When we put this out in public, it'll be a few days after, but you'd mentioned you'd been doing some reading around this date.
So when we first got on, I started talking about some things, did not know we were not recording, but I talked about a great colleague of ours, Alessandro Pomerico, who is the founder and director of the Free Home University in Lecce, Italy, and she travels between both New York City mostly and Lecce, Italy, who I started doing work with in 2015 through the Musa Geddes Foundation. Met her through my colleague Robert Simber of CRRED. And so she's part of a collective called Ecoversity. And they do these monthly calls, and she thought that that the moment, particularly around the George Floyd moment, was calling for them to engage in the conversation around race, global sort of Blackness, if you will. And she asked me to help her to articulate that conversation, but also to host the event. And so she got a colleague of hers, who is born in Kenya, who does work in Germany, to be in the dialogue. She also got an artist and an educator named Joal from Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I brought in my colleague and friend, Dr. Charlene Sinclair, who is the founder of the Center for Race and Religion and Economic Democracy. And what I realized that the day that we did it on last Sunday, June 28th, was LGBT Pride in New York City. Not only LGBT Pride, and because of COVID, we can't celebrate the way that we normally celebrate. And so not only was it Pride, it was the 50th anniversary of the very first Pride that happened in New York City in 1970. I thought about that this conversation we were having was sandwiched between Pride, but also tomorrow is the 4th of July. And some of the hypocrisy around this American project of democracy. Right? What a moment to be able to talk about that. So I started the conversation and I read something from Frederick Douglass, who had given a speech in 1852 in Rochester, New York, entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And then I read, as today, President Trump is giving a speech and has a rally in front of Mount Rushmore. And Mount Rushmore is the mountain in which 4 presidents are carved into the Black Hills Mountains of the great Sioux people. Sort of the contradiction in that. And so I wanted to, and if I could, read something from Frederick Douglass, something from the great chief of the Soy people, and sort of contextualize this moment. So Frederick Douglass writes, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all of your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour." And you place that in conversation with the great chief of the Sioux Nation, who just put out today. He said, "Nothing stands as a greater reminder to the great Sioux Nation of a country that cannot keep a promise or treaty than the faces carved into our sacred land on what the United States calls Mount Rushmore. We're now being forced to witness the lashing of our land with pomp, arrogance, and fire, hoping our sacred lands will survive. This brand on our flesh needs to be removed, and I am willing to do it free of charge to the United States by myself if I must. Visitors look upon the faces of those presidents and extol the virtues that they believe make America the country it is today. Lakota see the faces of the men who lied, cheated, and murdered innocent people whose only crime was living on the land they wanted to steal. The United States of America wishes for all of us to be citizens and a family of their republic, yet when they get bored of looking at those faces, we are left looking at our molesters. We are the ones who live under the stars of those who wronged us, while others have the privilege to look away and move on. We cannot. When I can remove those faces from our land, I believe I would not be alone." And so for me, those two sentiments speak very freely of what this moment meant. One in 1852 and the other in 2020. What to the great sin, the very first sin of America, again, is the genocide of indigenous people in dialogue with the bondage of African people.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar. It's been wonderful to speak with you, and really look forward to your visit to Vancouver when the border situation allows it, probably sometime early next year, but look forward to keeping this conversation going, and thank you so much for the amazing work that you do in so many different places.
And thank you for inviting me. And talk about looking forward to, I have never in my life been to Vancouver. So when COVID happened and I said, oh my God, does this mean I can't go to Vancouver? So I'm very excited being not only to come to visit Vancouver, but to be in dialogue with the wonderful people that I know are doing such great work there.
Yeah. Thank you.